Martinez, and the year I turned 26, my own mother stood on her crushed shell driveway and told me she could not be my safety net. Julian had been dead for 3 days. I stood on the limestone steps of her Tampa waterfront home with my twins, Leo and Maya, asleep in Julian's old truck. I had $14 to my name. I want you to picture the exact shade of her dark green silk blouse and the practiced regret on her face. Picture it clearly, because 8 years later, I would stand on a stage in front of 300 people holding a leather folder that contained $100 million, and I would watch that exact same face shatter when she realized she was walking away with nothing. Welcome back to Revenge Order, where ordinary people meet impossible family dynamics and the quiet ones learn to build their own empires. Drop a comment and tell me how old you are and where you are listening from today. Make sure you hit subscribe so you do not miss the next story. This one starts with a dark porch and ends with a microphone drop that ruined a legacy. Let me take you back to that porch. Julian died on a Tuesday. A rusted grading tractor flipped on a wet incline in rural Florida. He was 28. I was 26. The twins had just learned how to sit up. The county sheriff knocked on my door at dusk. I remember the sound of the gravel crunching under his boots before he even rang the bell. He took off his hat, and I knew. That night I sat on the linoleum floor of our rented trailer and spread out the bills. We were young and living on agricultural margins. There was no insurance policy. There was no savings account. Rent was due in 5 days. I factored in diapers, formula, and the truck payment. I ran the numbers until my hands shook. The answer was 0. I packed the twins into the truck and drove toward Tampa. My parents lived in a pristine estate with imported palms. I walked up those steps carrying a sleeping child in a carrier in each hand and rang the bell. Brenda opened the heavy mahogany door. She wore that green silk blouse and diamond studs. She looked at the scuffed toes of my boots and then at the faded canvas diaper bag. She did not step back to let me in. I asked for the guest room, just for 3 weeks until I could find work. My voice trembled and I hated the sound of it. Brenda folded her arms. The silk caught the amber glow of the porch light. Behind her in the foyer, my sister Vanessa stood holding a glass of wine. Vanessa met my gaze and then casually reached out and pulled the door a fraction closer to shutting. Brenda sighed the way you sigh at a stranger handing you a flyer. She told me they were stretched thin. She said Vanessa had business overhead and my father had his obligations. Then she said I chose this life with Julian and they could not be my safety net. She told me to call when things settled down. The door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place. A moment later, the amber porch light turned off, leaving me in the thick Florida humidity. I walked back to the truck. I had a quarter tank of gas. I drove until the fuel gauge dipped below the red line and pulled into a neon-lit station off the interstate. I sat under the fluorescent hum holding my cheap phone. I had one number left to call, Julian's parents in Ocala. I dialed it, not knowing I was about to meet my real family, and not knowing that the farm I was driving toward would become the battleground for everything I was about to build. I sat in the cab of Julian's truck, with the windows rolled down to let the damp night air circulate. The fluorescent lights of the gas station buzzed overhead, casting long, harsh shadows across the concrete pavement. My phone rested on the dashboard. I stared at the dark screen, fighting a bitter war with my own pride. I had just been turned away from a waterfront mansion with a crushed shell driveway by my own mother. Asking my in-laws for help felt like a final humiliating surrender. I knew Hector and Rosa Martinez were struggling. Julian used to send them a few $100s whenever his grading business had a profitable month. Bringing 2 hungry infants to their doorstep felt like tying an anchor to a drowning ship. I checked my wallet again. $14 and some loose coins. The fuel gauge was buried in the red zone, and Leo was starting to fuss in his car seat. I had no other options left on the table. Headlights swept across the desolate parking lot. A battered dual-cab pickup truck pulled in next to me. The engine knocked and sputtered before dying out with a metallic shudder. Hector stepped out first. His worn leather work boots hit the pavement with a heavy thud. He did not say a single word. He walked directly to the passenger side of my truck, opened the door, and gently unbuckled Maya from her seat. Rosa came around my side of the vehicle. She held a folded piece of fabric against her chest. It was a faded yellow knitted blanket. The edges were worn soft from years of frequent washing. She draped it over Leo, pulling the corners snug against the night chill. That yellow blanket was not expensive. It did not come wrapped in tissue paper like the rare gifts my mother occasionally sent and then demanded immediate thank you notes for. But as Rosa smoothed the yarn over my son's chest, I felt the first real warmth I had known in 3 days. She looked at my tear-streaked face and pointed toward their truck. "Get your things," she said. "We are going home." I followed their dim taillights north up the highway toward Ocala. The landscape slowly shifted from manicured suburban subdivisions to dark, sprawling pastures and wire fencing. We pulled into a long dirt driveway that wound toward a weathered single-story farmhouse. The white paint peeled around the window frames and the roof sagged slightly over the front porch. Inside, the kitchen smelled of roasted garlic and old pine floorboards. Hector set the car seats on the faded linoleum. Rosa went straight to the stove. She pulled down a ceramic bowl and set an extra plate at the scarred wooden table. They did not ask me how long I planned to stay. They did not ask for a detailed business plan or remind me of their own financial obligations. They simply made space. I sat at that table eating in silence, trying to swallow the tight lump forming in my throat. My biological parents required a steep entrance fee for their affection. My in-laws just required me to be breathing. But the quiet peace of the Ocala farmhouse hid a ticking clock. I woke up before dawn the next morning and found Hector sitting at the kitchen table holding a mug of black coffee. A stack of sorted mail sat in front of him. My eyes caught the bold red lettering printed across the top envelope. Notice of intent. I recognized that specific legal typography from my college days when I worked part-time handling paperwork at a real estate office. Hector slid his calloused hand over the paper, trying to hide it, but he was too late. I asked him straight out. He looked down at his knuckles and confessed the harsh truth. The bank had given them exactly 90 days, 3 months until foreclosure. The farm, the 60 acres, the barns, all of it was tied up in a commercial loan that had spiraled out of control after 2 bad hay yields. I had driven my children away from a closed door right onto a sinking ship. I could have panicked. I could have packed the truck again and tried to find a subsidized women's shelter in the city. But the sharp grief of losing Julian had calcified into something hard and highly useful inside my chest. I decided right then that Hector and Rosa would not lose this farm. I refused to sleep more than 4 hours a night. I traded my sorrow for punishing physical labor. I was out in the barns before the sun crested the tree line every single morning. I mucked stalls, repaired broken wire fencing, and hauled heavy feed sacks until my shoulders burned and my hands developed thick blisters. Work was the only language that made sense to me now. But I was not just a grieving widow doing manual labor. I held a specialized degree in equine genetics. I spent 4 years in university studying bone density bloodlines and the precise biomechanics of elite equine jumping performance. My parents had always mocked my degree as a cute little hobby while praising Vanessa's failing boutique as a real business venture. Julian and I had planned to start our own breeding program before the tractor accident. I knew how to read a horse the way a Wall Street broker reads a stock chart. I just needed raw material to work with. One evening during my second week, I was sweeping the back aisle of the main barn when I heard a soft, rhythmic scraping. I followed the sound to the last stall at the end of the row. Standing in the shadows was an undersized warm-blood mare. Her coat was a dull, dusty brown, and she lacked the towering height of traditional jumping horses. Hector came up behind me and told me her name was Clementine. He explained she was a byproduct of a failed breeding deal from a few years back. The local wealthy buyers had taken one look at her short stature and immediately passed. He planned to send her to a low-end auction by the end of the month just to clear her feed bill off his ledger. I unlatched the stall door and stepped inside. Clementine backed into the corner, wary of my presence. I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the roof slats. I watched the way she shifted her weight. I looked closely at the angle of her hindquarters and the specific inward rotation of her hock joints. Most traditional breeders obsessed over a horse's standing height. They wanted tall, long-legged animals that looked impressive standing still for a photograph. They entirely missed the hidden mechanics of physical leverage. Clementine was compact, but her lower joints were built like coiled springs. The way her legs gathered under her center of gravity was genetically rare and highly valuable for explosive upward movement. I reached out and rested my hand on her neck, feeling the solid, dense muscle trembling beneath her coat. A sudden shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. I stepped back and mapped out the physiological geometry in my head. Everyone saw a runt headed for the auction block, but as I watched Clementine move in the dark, I did not see a reject. I saw the foundation of an empire. I spent the next 3 nights in the barn under the dim glow of a single hanging bulb. I ran my hands down Clementine's legs, feeling the tight tendons and the unusual angle of her hock joints. Dust motes danced in the stale air. I closed my eyes and let my muscle memory take over. Suddenly, I was not standing in a foreclosed Ocala barn anymore. I was back in a sunlit pasture from 2 summers ago, standing next to Julian. In my memory, Julian wore his faded denim shirt smelling of cut grass and diesel fuel. He had placed his calloused hands over mine, guiding my fingers down the hind leg of a different horse. His voice echoed clearly in my mind, cutting through the heavy grief that clouded my daily thoughts. Do not look at how they stand, Hales. Look at how they load the weight. The height does not dictate the flight. The leverage does. I opened my eyes. Julian was gone, but his wisdom remained anchored in my mind. I looked at the undersized brown mare chewing quietly in her stall. She had the exact leverage Julian described. Her physical geometry was a coiled spring waiting for the right trigger. I started training her the very next morning. While the rest of the farm slept, I set up makeshift jumps using cracked wooden rails and empty plastic barrels. Clementine was hesitant at first. She lacked confidence because every previous handler had treated her like a fragile mistake. I did not treat her like a mistake. I demanded focus. Within 2 weeks, she was clearing the barrels with a strange, explosive grace that made my heart race. Her hind legs dropped low into the dirt, gathering kinetic energy before launching her upward with a smooth, snapping motion. We needed to prove her value in a public arena. I sold the only piece of jewelry I had left from my teenage years to afford the entry fee and a tank of fuel. I loaded Clementine into Hector's rusty 2-horse trailer and drove 3 hours south to Wellington. Wellington was the epicenter of elite Florida equestrian society. It was a world built on generational wealth, imported European bloodlines, and pristine appearances. The showgrounds looked like a luxury resort. Sprawling green vendor tents lined the manicured arenas where spectators drank chilled champagne and wore wide-brimmed hats. I pulled Hector's rattling truck between rows of gleaming, climate-controlled equine transport rigs. I unloaded Clementine, wearing my frayed riding boots and a second-hand show jacket that pinched my shoulders. I led my undersized mare toward the warm-up ring, keeping my head down. But in circles like this, anonymity is a rare luxury. I heard the sharp click of expensive heels on the asphalt behind me. A woman named Victoria stepped into my path. She was a prominent socialite from Tampa who frequently attended my parents' summer charity galas. She wore a tailored white riding habit that cost more than my truck. Victoria let her eyes travel up and down my faded jacket before landing on Clementine. Her lips curved into a thin, mocking smile. "Haley Martinez," she said, letting the name hang in the air. "Brenda mentioned you were going through a rough patch, but bringing a low-grade pony to a Wellington showcase? Are you lost, dear?" A few other riders gathered nearby, pausing to listen. They exchanged amused glances, looking at my battered boots. A year ago, a comment like that from a woman in my mother's inner circle would have made my face burn with shame. I would have mumbled an excuse and looked at the ground. But the woman who used to crave their approval died on a dark porch in Tampa. I did not argue with Victoria. I did not raise my voice to defend my horse. I looked right through her, shifting my gaze to the main arena gate. Silence is a weapon people like Victoria do not know how to fight. Her smile faltered as I walked past her without saying a single word. My number was called over the loudspeaker 20 minutes later. I rode Clementine into the grand arena. The pristine white fences looked intimidating. The course was designed to test large, long-strided warmbloods with wide oxer jumps and punishing height requirements. The crowd murmured as we entered. I could hear the faint sound of suppressed laughter from the VIP section. Clementine flicked her ears back, sensing the unfamiliar pressure. I leaned forward and patted her neck. "Just load the weight," I whispered. The starting bell chimed. We pushed into a canter. Clementine approached the first vertical jump. I felt her hesitate, but I kept my leg pressure firm and steady. She sank into her haunches, digging her hooves into the premium footing. Then she launched. We cleared the first rail by a generous 4 inches. The faint laughter in the crowd died instantly. We took the second jump and then the third. Clementine found her rhythm. Her compact frame allowed her to navigate the tight turns between fences faster than the tall imported horses ever could. She did not just jump over the obstacles. She bounded over them with an elastic snapping force. We approached the final combination. It was a daunting double oxer that had already knocked points off a dozen elite competitors. I loosened the reins, trusting her instincts. Clementine drove her hind legs deep into the dirt, coiled her body, and sprang into the air. We flew over the final rail, suspended in a moment of pure gravity-defying silence. Her hooves hit the ground with a rhythmic thud. We crossed the finish timer flawless and fast. The digital scoreboard flashed green. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators, followed by a sudden wave of genuine applause. The wealthy critics who had mocked my boots were now leaning over the railings, trying to figure out the breeding lineage of the little brown mare. We left the arena with a blue ribbon pinned to Clementine's bridle. Victoria stood near the exit gate, clutching her riding crop. She did not say a word as we passed. I drove back to Ocala with the windows down, feeling the first spark of real hope ignite in my chest. We had proven the genetics. The Martinez line had a future. I pulled the truck up to the farmhouse, eager to show Hector the blue ribbon. But the porch was dead quiet. Hector sat on the top step, holding a piece of heavy creamed cardstock. His shoulders were slumped forward. Rosa stood behind him, gripping the wooden railing with white knuckles. I parked the truck and walked slowly toward the house. The spark in my chest snuffed out instantly. Hector handed me the paper without speaking. It bore the official seal of the county clerk, Notice of Public Auction. The bank had rejected their request for a payment extension. We had exactly 30 days before the sheriff arrived to put padlocks on the barn doors. I stared at the blue ribbon in my hand. A terrible realization washed over me. Ribbons command respect. Ribbons rewrite your reputation in high society. But ribbons do not pay commercial bank debts. We needed serious liquid capital, and we needed it before the end of the month. Winning a jumping class had only painted a target on my back. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the heavy silence. A silver Mercedes SUV turned into the driveway, moving with a slow, deliberate crawl. It bypassed the guest parking and pulled directly up to the main barn. The engine cut off. A woman stepped out, wearing a designer linen suit and oversized sunglasses. She surveyed our peeling paint and sagging roof with the cold, calculating eyes of a butcher inspecting a herd. We needed a miracle to save the farm. The universe had delivered a predator instead. Before the woman in the linen suit could utter her first demand, my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. The caller ID flashed a Tampa area code. The timing felt like a cruel joke. It was Christmas morning. 4 months had passed since Julian died. 4 months since the porch light clicked off and plunged my life into darkness. I had spent the morning trying to wrap small, inexpensive wooden toys for the twins while Rosa baked cinnamon bread. I stared at the flashing screen for 3 rings before I finally answered. Brenda spoke first. Her voice sounded bright and perfectly modulated, carrying the upbeat cadence of a woman hosting a charity luncheon. She did not ask how I was coping. She did not ask if I had enough money to buy groceries. She launched immediately into a detailed monologue about her own life. Richard had just secured a premier membership at a new private golf club, she boasted. She spent 3 minutes describing the imported grass on the fairways and the strict vetting process for new members. Then she transitioned to Vanessa. My sister was apparently expanding her failing boutique into a new commercial retail space downtown. Brenda spoke about Vanessa's visionary business acumen with deep reverence. I stood on the dirt driveway holding the phone to my ear, listening to my mother recount the trivial triumphs of people who had locked me out. I let her finish, then she paused, taking a deliberate breath. "So how are the babies?" she asked. The words hung in the humid Florida air. The babies. My children were almost a year old. They had distinct personalities, distinct laughs, and names that Julian and I had carefully chosen together. And my own mother calling on Christmas morning could not recall them? She had filed her only grandchildren away under a generic label. "Leo and Maya," I said. My tone remained flat, devoid of any rising anger. "They are doing fine." "Yes, of course," she replied, brushing past the correction with seamless grace. "Well, give them a kiss for us. We just wanted to check in. Happy holidays, Haley." The line went dead. I lowered the phone. A year ago, that brief interaction would have crushed me. I would have spent days dissecting the conversation, trying to figure out how to make them care. But looking at Hector, holding a foreclosure notice, and Rosa gripping the porch rail, I realized my biological family viewed me entirely as a written-off asset. They only called to conduct a mandatory emotional inventory. I made a silent vow, standing right there in the dirt. I would never grant them another emotional reaction as long as I lived. I slid the phone back into my pocket and turned my attention to the silver Mercedes. The woman adjusting her oversized sunglasses was named Sylvia. She was a known entity in the Wellington equestrian circuit. Sylvia operated as a ruthless private investor, buying up distressed equine properties and liquidating their assets for rapid profit. She walked up to the porch, navigating the uneven ground in expensive leather loafers. "I saw your little performance yesterday at the jumping showcase," she began without offering a formal greeting. "The mare has an interesting physiological quirk. It might be reproducible under strict genetic controls. I did a bit of digging on the drive up here." Sylvia removed her sunglasses and looked directly at Hector. "It seems you have a rather urgent banking problem, Mr. Martinez. Public records indicate your commercial loan matures in exactly 30 days. But realistically, the bank will move to seize the physical assets by the end of the week if you fail to post a massive collateral deposit." Hector tightened his grip on the heavy cream cardstock. He refused to look at her. I stepped off the bottom porch stair, placing myself squarely between the investor and my father-in-law. "What is your offer?" I asked. Sylvia smiled. It was a cold, calculated expression that did not reach her eyes. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, stapled legal document. She held it out, offering it like a life preserver to a drowning crew. $200,000 wired directly into the bank escrow account by tomorrow morning, she stated smoothly. That covers the primary debt arrears and stops the sheriff from padlocking your barns. It keeps a roof over your head. I took the thick document. The paper felt heavy and crisp. "What do you get in return?" Sylvia tilted her head. "I require an 80% controlling equity stake in the physical farm and its future operations. Furthermore, I require total exclusive control of the mare's genetic rights. Any future breeding decisions, sales, or full registrations will be processed exclusively through my Wellington holding company. You keep your house, you get a modest salary to manage the daily stable chores, but the Martinez bloodline belongs to me." She crossed her arms, waiting for the desperation to settle in. It was a classic predatory maneuver. Sylvia knew we had 48 hours before the banking authorities initiated asset seizure. She expected me to break down, crying in relief, and sign the papers on the hood of her luxury SUV. She thought she was dealing with a naive 26-year-old widow who had no understanding of corporate leverage. I looked down at the stapled contract. I read the bold legal terminology, mapping out the total surrender of our future. Sylvia thought she had me backed into a corner, but she did not realize I had already learned how to read a bad contract from the masters. My own family had drafted the blueprint for transactional exploitation long before this Wellington shark ever drove up my driveway. "I will review the terms," I told her, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Sylvia laughed a sharp, dismissive sound. "You have 48 hours, dear. Do not take too long to read the fine print. The bank moves faster than you think." She turned around and climbed back into her Mercedes. The tires kicked up a cloud of white dust as she reversed down the long driveway. Hector put his hand on my shoulder. His calloused fingers trembled slightly. "We cannot give away 80% Haley. We will just be tenant farmers on our own land. But if we do not sign, we lose the roof over the babies' heads." Rosa stepped down from the porch. She did not cry. She just touched the faded yellow blanket resting on the railing. I looked at the two people who had fed me when I had $14 to my name. I was not going to let a predator turn them into indentured servants. "We are not signing this," I told Hector, tapping the thick document against my palm. "But we are also not losing the farm. I have a plan." The bank clock was ticking down the final hours. We needed serious legal firepower to dismantle Sylvia's trap. I pulled out my wallet and retrieved my last remaining emergency credit card, the one I had promised Julian I would only use for medical disasters. Defending our future against a hostile corporate takeover qualified as a disaster. I walked into the farmhouse, picked up the landline, and dialed the number of the most aggressive corporate lawyer operating in Marion County. We were going to war. The lawyer's name was Elena. She drove a scuffed sedan and operated out of a cramped office situated above a failing strip mall in downtown Ocala. When I first walked into her workspace, carrying the thick legal document Sylvia had handed me, Elena did not offer me a sympathetic smile. She did not ask about my late husband or express pity for my situation. She simply pushed a pair of reading glasses up the bridge of her nose and demanded my credit card. I handed over the plastic rectangle, knowing it contained exactly $500 in available credit. It was the absolute last financial resource I possessed. Elena swiped the card through an old machine, the transaction approved with a sharp mechanical beep. Elena pulled the contract across her desk, uncapped a red ink pen, and began reading. For 2 hours, the only sound in the office was the scratching of the red pen against the crisp paper. Elena slashed through entire paragraphs of dense legalese. She crossed out indemnity clauses, non-compete agreements, and restrictive covenants designed to trap me in perpetual servitude. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "This is not a rescue operation," she said, tapping the red pen against the desk. "This is a hostage situation. This woman wants to own every foal that mare produces for the next 20 years. She wants the branding rights, the facility operation rights, and the ultimate authority to liquidate the property if you miss a single performance metric. If you sign this as written, you will be an employee on your own land, and she can fire you at any time." I nodded slowly. I already knew Sylvia was a predator. I just needed to know how to build a cage. "How do we restructure it?" I asked. Elena leaned back in her chair. "We rewrite the foundational terms. We strip away her equity claim on the physical 60 acres. We reduce her 80% controlling stake down to a 20% passive shareholder position. Most importantly, we construct an impenetrable firewall around the mare's genetic rights. You retain 100% exclusive ownership of the bloodline. Sylvia receives 20% of the net profits from future foal sales, but she gets zero voting power regarding breeding decisions." I stared at the heavily redlined document. Will she accept those terms? Elena gave a dry, humorless chuckle. A Wellington shark expects the bleeding fish to surrender. When the fish fights back, they usually swim away. But if her primary goal is securing a foothold in a highly lucrative new bloodline, she might bite. You just have to hold your nerve during the negotiation. Do not blink. The next morning, Sylvia returned to the farm. She parked her silver Mercedes SUV in the exact same spot, kicking up white dust against the barn doors. She walked up to the porch, wearing another designer linen suit and carrying a silver briefcase. She expected to find a weeping, desperate widow ready to hand over a generational asset. Instead, she found me, sitting at the scarred wooden table on the porch, with Elena seated quietly beside me. The heavily redacted contract rested between us. Sylvia stopped at the bottom of the stairs. She surveyed the scene and her polished smile tightened into a rigid line. "What is this?" she demanded. "This is a counteroffer," Elena stated, her voice cool and authoritative. I slid the modified document across the wooden table. Sylvia picked it up and began flipping through the pages. Her eyes darted back and forth, tracking the extensive red ink revisions. I watched her perfectly manicured fingernails dig into the paper. The silence stretched thick and suffocating under the Florida morning heat. "This is unacceptable," Sylvia finally snapped, tossing the document back onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "You have stripped my operational control. You have reduced my equity position to a minority share, and you expect me to fund your banking crisis without securing any genetic ownership of the mare? You are delusional." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. "Those are the terms," I said softly. Sylvia laughed, a harsh, biting sound meant to intimidate. "You have 24 hours before the sheriff arrives to seize this property. You have zero leverage. If I walk back to my car right now, you lose everything. You lose the roof over your children, you lose the mare, you lose the farm. I am the only lifeline you have." She turned around and took 2 deliberate steps toward her luxury SUV, waiting for me to break. She waited for the frantic plea, the tearful apology, the desperate compromise. I remained completely silent. I let the ambient sounds of the farm fill the void. The wind rustling through the live oak trees, the distant whinny of a horse, the creak of the wooden porch boards. I sat there, anchored by the cold, hard truth I had learned on my parents' porch. People who use leverage to force compliance are cowards. They rely on your fear to complete the transaction. If you remove the fear, their entire strategy collapses. Sylvia stopped halfway to her car. Her hand hovered near the door handle. She slowly turned back around, her face flushed with barely contained fury. She had miscalculated my desperation. She recognized that the compact brown mare standing in the back stall was a rare genetic anomaly. The potential profits from the Martinez bloodline far outweighed the initial $200,000 investment. If she walked away, she lost her chance to secure a piece of an emerging empire. She walked back up the porch stairs, her heels striking the wood with sharp, aggressive strikes. She pulled a silver pen from her briefcase, leaned over the scarred table, and slashed her signature across the final page of the revised contract. She did not offer a polite farewell. She threw the document back at Elena, turned on her heel, and drove away, leaving a cloud of exhaust in her wake. Hector and Rosa stepped out from the kitchen screen door. Rosa touched my shoulder gently. Elena packed the signed contract into her leather briefcase, giving me a rare nod of genuine respect. We had done it. We had secured the capital to pay off the commercial bank loan, stop the foreclosure, and protect the genetic future of Clementine's bloodline. I had successfully defended the farm and established the legal foundation for my future business. I watched the dust settle at the end of the driveway, feeling a profound sense of victory. I had outmaneuvered a ruthless corporate investor. I had built a fortress around my new family. But true predators rarely hunt alone. They hunt in packs, and they often wear familiar faces. I signed Sylvia's contract thinking I had just outsmarted a Wellington shark. I felt a surge of pride knowing I had secured our independence. I would not find out until years later that the silver pen I used to finalize the deal might as well have belonged to my own mother. 7 years passed. The Florida seasons blurred into a steady rhythm of early mornings and late nights. The peeling white paint on the old Ocala farmhouse disappeared under layers of fresh, premium weatherproofing. The sagging barn roof was replaced by sleek steel and tempered glass. The cracked dirt driveway transformed into smooth, dark asphalt, lined with mature oak trees. We did not just survive the banking crisis, we rewrote the entire landscape of the regional equestrian industry. Clementine delivered her first foal during a brutal summer thunderstorm. We named him Atlas. 3 years later, Atlas cleared a 6-foot oxer at the national trials with the same explosive kinetic snap his mother possessed. He did not just jump, he defied gravity. Buyers from across the country started calling the farm before the competition even concluded. The Martinez line became a recognized sovereign entity in the breeding world. But I knew that breeding alone relied too heavily on unpredictable biology. I wanted an airtight business model. I spent my evenings sitting at the kitchen island, staring at a glowing laptop screen. I partnered with an independent software developer and combined my university degree in equine genetics with modern data analytics. We built a proprietary tracking algorithm. The software mapped the specific joint angles, bone density markers, and leverage geometry of every foal Clementine produced. It predicted jumping trajectories based on DNA sequencing. Within 2 years, our software became an industry standard. Elite training facilities across the globe paid premium monthly subscription fees just to access our predictive database. The revenue stream shifted from simple livestock sales to recurring global tech licensing. The 60 acres expanded. We purchased the surrounding pastures, building an elite Olympic training compound equipped with climate-controlled stables and hydrotherapy treadmills. The valuation of the Martinez brand, the technology, and the bloodline pushed steadily toward the 9-figure mark. Hector and Rosa no longer worried about red-lettered envelopes arriving in the mail. They spent their afternoons sitting on the wraparound porch, watching Leo and Maya run through the sunlit paddocks. I managed international contracts and negotiated syndication rights. We had built an empire from the dirt up. Then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the past arrived in a heavy manila envelope. The courier required my signature for the certified parcel. The return address belonged to a high-rise corporate law firm operating out of Tampa. I took the package into the kitchen and slid a letter opener through the thick paper seal. It was a formal legal petition drafted on behalf of my father. Richard was petitioning the county court to legally sever my name from my late grandfather's educational trust. My grandfather had left a modest fund designated equally for his grandchildren. It was not life-changing wealth, but it held deep sentimental value. Richard sought a judicial order to reallocate the entire sum directly to Vanessa. Her downtown retail boutique was hemorrhaging cash and required an immediate capital injection to avoid bankruptcy. To justify the legal severance, the Tampa lawyers needed to demonstrate long-term familial estrangement. They had to convince a judge that I had abandoned my family unit and forfeited my right to the inheritance. I flipped through the dense pages of legal arguments. In their rush to build a compelling narrative, the careless junior associates had attached a stack of internal family communications as supporting evidence. They labeled it Exhibit C. I turned to the back of the packet. My eyes landed on a printed email thread. The timestamp caught my attention immediately. The first message was sent exactly 4 days after Julian died. It was the morning after the porch light clicked off. I traced my finger over the harsh black ink. Brenda wrote the initial email to Richard and Vanessa. She described my arrival on her doorstep as a calculated, manipulative burden. She typed the specific words, bad investment. She stated that funneling their resources into a grieving widow with 2 infants would drain the capital meant for Vanessa's promising future. Richard replied an hour later. His message sat right below hers. He agreed with her financial assessment, praising Vanessa's business acumen, but he added a specific strategic caveat. He instructed Brenda to maintain a polite distance rather than a hostile break. "We keep the door cracked," he wrote. "We stay cordial just in case her little horse venture ever turns a profit." I sat at the kitchen island and read the exchange 3 times. I did not cry. My pulse remained slow and steady. The fragile, lingering hope that my parents had simply made a panicked mistake 8 years ago dissolved into fine ash. They had calculated my market value while I was trying to figure out how to pay for my husband's funeral. They viewed me as a dormant stock option. I folded the paper precisely in half. I placed it inside my leather folio along with the rest of the petition. I picked up my keys and drove straight into town. Elena no longer operated out of a cramped office above a failing strip mall. She now occupied a pristine, glass-walled corner suite in the financial district, a testament to the lucrative contracts we had negotiated together over the years. I walked into her office and dropped the manila envelope onto her polished mahogany desk. "Block the trust severance," I told her, taking a seat opposite her monitor. Elena adjusted her reading glasses and opened the file. She skimmed the petition, her professional detachment firmly in place. Her expression shifted slightly when she reached the attached emails in Exhibit C. She read the cruel exchange between my parents. She did not offer empty apologies. She simply turned her attention to her dual-monitor setup and began typing. "I want to know their current leverage," Elena murmured, her eyes scanning digital lines of corporate data. If Richard is desperate enough to petition a court for a modest grandfathered trust, his primary assets must be under severe distress. Let us see where his money lives. The rhythmic clatter of her keyboard filled the quiet office. Elena navigated through public registries, accessing offshore holding records, and shell company registrations linked to the Tampa law firm representing my father. She cross-referenced Richard's financial footprint against regional business filings. I watched the city traffic moving far below the window, waiting for her assessment. Then the typing abruptly stopped. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise. Elena leaned closer to the glowing screen. She pressed the page-down key, scrolling through a complex web of limited liability corporations. The color slowly drained from her face. She removed her reading glasses and set them carefully on the desk. She looked across the room at me. The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly thin. "Haley," she whispered. Her voice carried a rare note of genuine shock. I sat forward. "What did you find?" Elena turned her monitor so I could see the screen. It displayed a corporate ownership flowchart. At the bottom of the chart sat the Wellington Holding Company that had offered me the predatory contract 7 years ago. The company managed by the woman in the linen suit. "Sylvia did not fund your farm," Elena said. I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend the complex web of shell entities linking back to a single primary source in Tampa. Elena met my gaze. Her eyes were dark and serious. "Your parents did." I stared at the glowing monitor on the mahogany desk. The organizational flowchart traced a complex labyrinth of corporate shell entities. At the very top of the hierarchy sat a wealth management holding firm. I recognized the registered address immediately. It was the exact same downtown Tampa building where my father kept his primary investment accounts. Sylvia was never an independent Wellington shark hunting for vulnerable farms. She was a hired proxy. She was a well-dressed ghost carrying my parents' checkbook. Elena pointed a silver pen at the screen. "They knew the bank was foreclosing on Hector and Rosa," she explained. Her tone remained clinical and precise, anchoring my spinning thoughts. "Your father monitored the county public records. He saw the notice of auction filed by the commercial lender. Instead of calling you or offering a standard family loan, he structured a blind trust. He hired Sylvia to secure an 80% stake in your farm while intentionally keeping his own name off the legal paperwork." The reality of their scheme settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. When I stood on their porch begging for a guest room, they viewed me as a worthless liability. But the moment Clementine won that blue ribbon in her first showcase, my parents recalculated my market value. They realized the Martinez bloodline held immense untapped profit potential. Rather than help their widowed daughter build a secure future, they decided to acquire my desperation for pennies on the dollar. They wanted to own the empire without ever getting their hands dirty. If I had signed Sylvia's original contract, my mother and father would have controlled every foal, every pasture, and every business decision I made. I would have been an unwitting tenant farmer, laboring under the Florida sun for the exact people who locked me out in the cold. I would have spent my life making them richer. I leaned back in the plush leather chair. The lingering, fragile fragments of daughterly duty evaporated into the air-conditioned chill of the office. I did not feel sorrow. I felt forged. I felt like pure, tempered steel ready to cut through stone. "Can we prove Sylvia breached her fiduciary duty by hiding the proxy source?" I asked. I kept my voice devoid of emotion. Elena closed the file folder, resting her hands flat on the desk. "I need to dig deep into the original disclosure clauses. It will require extensive forensic accounting, but yes, there are specific legal avenues to challenge the 20% minority stake she currently holds. Hiding a familial conflict of interest during a distressed asset negotiation is a severe violation. Find the breach," I said. "Tear the contract apart." The universe possesses a strange sense of timing. The very next morning, a prominent national business magazine hit the newsstands. I had participated in a brief interview weeks prior, expecting a minor feature in the technology section. Instead, the publication placed my face on the front cover. The headline praised the revolutionary equine genetics software. The authors estimated the Ocala training facility valuation near the 9-figure threshold. The article detailed our transition from a struggling dirt farm to a global industry leader. It painted a picture of resilience, cutting-edge data analytics, and staggering financial success. I knew exactly what would happen the moment that glossy magazine circulated through the wealthy zip codes of Tampa. The silent investors would suddenly crave the spotlight. 2 days later, I transported Atlas to a premier exhibition in Wellington. The atmosphere buzzed with elite breeders and potential international buyers. I stood near the warm-up ring, wearing a tailored Navy show jacket, discussing licensing fees with a European syndicate representative. The air smelled of expensive leather grooming spray and fresh turf. I heard the familiar sharp click of designer heels on the pavement. I turned slowly. Brenda and Richard walked through the VIP entrance. They did not come alone. A professional photographer trailed a few steps behind them, adjusting a long camera lens. Brenda wore a pristine white silk dress that caught the afternoon sunlight. Richard sported a crisp gray linen suit. They moved through the affluent crowd with practiced grace, waving to wealthy acquaintances and projecting the aura of a deeply united family. They spotted me standing near the staging area and zeroed in like heat-seeking missiles. Brenda threw her arms open, presenting a bright, ecstatic smile. "Haley, darling," she called out, ensuring her voice carried across the busy paddock. "We are so incredibly proud of you." She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. I felt the cold flash of her diamond rings against my neck. Over her shoulder, I watched the hired photographer snap rapidly, capturing the fabricated reunion. Brenda held the embrace just long enough to ensure the society pages secured a perfect image of maternal devotion. She pulled back, resting her manicured hands on my sleeves. "We read the article," she said, speaking loud enough for the European representative to hear. "We always knew you had this extraordinary talent inside you. Family supports family through the hard times." I looked into her eyes. They held no warmth. They held only strategic calculation. My parents were launching a coordinated image offensive. They recognized that a monumental syndication deal loomed on the horizon. To secure their 20% payout without public scrutiny, they needed the world to believe they had funded and nurtured my success from the very beginning. They were retroactively inserting themselves into my origin story. I did not pull away. I did not scream or cause a public scene. I stood perfectly still, allowing the camera to capture my calm, unreadable expression. I let them build their hollow narrative. I knew a public argument would only serve their agenda, making me look like an unstable, ungrateful child. I played my part, mirroring the silent stoicism I used to train nervous horses. The exhibition continued. I guided Atlas through a flawless jumping routine, while Brenda clapped enthusiastically from the prime viewing box. Later in the afternoon, I walked toward the secluded trailer parking lot to retrieve a fresh saddle pad. The noise of the crowd faded behind the rows of gleaming, climate-controlled transport rigs. The Florida heat radiated off the asphalt. Richard stepped out from behind my trailer. He had separated from Brenda and the photographer. He held his linen suit jacket over one arm, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding direct eye contact. "Haley," he began, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur, "I know the optics today feel a bit forced. Your mother just wants to celebrate your victories. We know things were difficult when Julian passed. We made some choices based on bad financial advice back then. I want to clear the air between us." He offered a half-baked apology, layered in passive excuses. He blamed abstract financial advisors for the night he let his daughter drive away with $14 and 2 hungry infants. He wanted absolution without confession. He wanted to feel like a good father before he collected his hidden corporate dividends. I did not offer him grace. I looked at the imported leather of his shoes and then met his wavering gaze. "Where are you standing right now?" I asked. Richard blinked, confused by the question. "What do you mean? I am right here. We are standing together." "No, you are not," I replied, my tone flat and even. "You are standing wherever Brenda tells you to stand. You waited 8 years to apologize, and you only did it when no cameras were around." Richard opened his mouth to formulate a defense. The words died in his throat. He looked down at the gravel, unable to sustain the eye contact. His silence confirmed everything I needed to know. He was a hollow vessel. I turned and walked away, leaving him in the shadows of the transport rigs. I climbed into the cab of my truck and started the engine. My parents believed their proxy trap was airtight. They thought they owned 20% of my life. They thought they could manipulate the narrative and collect millions from my sweat. I had 3 weeks to make sure they walked away with zero. The offer arrived on a Thursday morning inside a slate gray leather portfolio. 3 executives from a global lifestyle and equestrian syndicate flew into Ocala on a private charter. They walked the perimeter of the Olympic training compound, inspecting the climate-controlled stables and the digital infrastructure of our genetics tracking software. They did not ask probing questions. They simply presented the portfolio and returned to their waiting town car. I carried the slate gray folder back to the original farmhouse. I sat at the same scarred wooden table where Hector and Rosa had fed me my first hot meal 8 years prior. I opened the cover. The printed figure seemed to vibrate off the heavy cardstock. $100 million. It was not merely a large sum of money. It represented generational wealth. It meant Leo and Maya would never stand on a dark porch begging for shelter. It meant Hector and Rosa could spend their twilight years wrapped in total security. The number held the power to erase every sleepless night, every blistered hand, every moment of suffocating fear I had endured since Julian died. I traced the zeros with my index finger. The syndicate wanted purchasing rights to the technology, the brand, and the Martinez bloodline. The transition would be clean and final. I closed the folder, feeling a profound quiet settle over my chest. But financial secrets in Florida resemble water in a cracked clay pot. They always find a way to seep out. By noon the following day, a regional business blog published a speculative article detailing the imminent acquisition. The headline flashed across social media feeds, circulating rapidly through the Wellington circuits and the Tampa country clubs. My phone rested on the kitchen island. It began to vibrate. Then it rang. Then the screen filled with an endless cascade of incoming text messages. The sudden influx of manufactured affection was nauseating. Brenda sent a string of congratulatory messages decorated with celebratory emojis, claiming she was crying tears of joy. Richard left a long voicemail suggesting a private family dinner to toast my triumph. Even Vanessa sent a text proposing a sisterly coffee date to catch up on lost time. The people who had treated me like a dormant stock option were now rushing to the front row, expecting their dividends to clear. I ignored every single notification. I knew the real attack would not come disguised as love. It would come wrapped in legal threats. My intuition proved correct 24 hours later. Elena called me from her downtown office. Her voice carried a sharp, rigid edge. She instructed me to drive over immediately. When I walked into the glass-walled suite, Elena did not offer me a cup of coffee or a comfortable chair. She stood behind her mahogany desk, holding a certified legal notice. Sylvia invoked the veto, Elena stated, skipping any polite preamble. I stopped in the center of the room. What veto? Elena spread the original 7-year-old contract across the polished wood. She highlighted a dense paragraph buried deep within the minority shareholder provisions. It was a standard corporate defense mechanism that we had compromised on to secure the initial funding. The clause mandated that any total buyout or majority asset transfer required unanimous shareholder consent. Sylvia, holding her 20% proxy stake, possessed the legal authority to block the entire syndicate acquisition. She filed a formal injunction this morning, Elena explained. The syndicate lawyers received a copy. The acquisition is effectively frozen. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. What does she want? Elena picked up a secondary document. A ransom note wrapped in corporate jargon. The proxy holder refuses to authorize the sale unless you restructure the current equity distribution. She demands a 50% stake in the final payout. $50 million. My parents, utilizing their well-dressed ghost, were holding a $100 million deal hostage. They knew the syndicate would walk away if the ownership rights remained tangled in litigation. They calculated my threshold for pain, betting that I would surrender half my empire just to guarantee the sale went through. They wanted $50 million for a farm they refused to visit and a bloodline they once mocked. If I sign the amendment, they get half, I said, staring at the highlighted text. Yes, Elena replied. The injunction disappears and the sale proceeds without friction. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the busy intersection below. Paying them off represented the path of least resistance. It would finalize the deal and secure $50 million for my children. Many business owners would swallow their pride and sign the check. But I knew the precise psychological makeup of my biological family. If I paid the ransom, the transaction would never truly conclude. They would forever view me as a yielding target. They would haunt my future, using the payout to fuel their own public narratives, painting themselves as the architects of my success. They would attend my industry events, claim credit for my hard work, and demand continuous access to my children. I turned away from the glass. We do not negotiate, I told Elena. Reject the amendment. Elena raised an eyebrow. The syndicate will not wait forever, Haley. Corporate buyers despise messy shareholder disputes. Let them wait, I countered. But my refusal to surrender triggered a swift and venomous retaliation. The moment Elena formally rejected the 50% demand, the Tampa faction changed their tactics. If they could not extort the money quietly, they decided to burn my reputation to the ground. Vanessa spearheaded the sabotage. She maintained deep social connections within the Florida equestrian scene. Over the next 3 days, anonymous tips began surfacing on prominent industry blogs. The articles cited unnamed insiders, claiming the Martinez training facility utilized unethical breeding practices. Whispers circulated through the Wellington barns, suggesting our genetic software produced flawed data. Vanessa orchestrated a whisper campaign designed to generate toxic smoke. The strategy was transparent and highly effective. Corporate syndicates avoid bad press. The buyers grew nervous watching the speculative rumors spread across digital platforms. The lead executive from the syndicate requested an urgent conference call. I sat in my home office staring at the speakerphone. The executive did not mince words. He expressed severe concern regarding the pending shareholder litigation and the sudden influx of negative media coverage. The board of directors demanded a clean acquisition. We cannot inherit a fractured brand, Haley, the executive stated. His tone was polite but firm. We value your technology, but the current optics are unacceptable. We need this ownership dispute resolved and the negative press neutralized. You have 14 days to deliver a clean title. If the proxy injunction remains active after 2 weeks, we withdraw the offer entirely. The line disconnected, leaving a hollow dial tone echoing in the room. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. The walls were closing in. Vanessa continued to feed the gossip blogs. Brenda and Richard waited in their waterfront estate, expecting my impending surrender. The syndicate gave me 14 days to clear the shareholder dispute, or the $100 million walked. It was time to find a poison pill. The ticking clock amplified the pressure inside the Ocala farmhouse. 14 days felt like a rapidly evaporating resource. The syndicate required a clean title, and my family held the only mechanism to release the legal freeze. I spent the weekend reviewing contingency plans with Elena, but every path forward seemed blocked by the ironclad veto clause Sylvia had invoked. On Monday morning, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Vanessa's name. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity overrode my caution. I answered, expecting another thinly veiled threat or a smug update regarding her ongoing whisper campaign. Instead, I heard the raw, ragged sound of a woman hyperventilating. Haley Vanessa gasped. Her voice hitched, catching in her throat. "You have to stop this! You have to end this right now! Please!" I gripped the phone tighter. "Stop what, Vanessa?" "It is Dad," she sobbed. The sound of her crying felt visceral and untethered, echoing the frantic grief I remembered from the night Julian died. "His heart, Haley. He collapsed yesterday afternoon in the foyer. The paramedics rushed him to Tampa General. The doctors say his arterial blockages are severe. The stress of this entire legal battle is literally killing him." I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, my gaze locked onto the grain of the wooden cabinets, but I did not truly see them. A sudden heavy weight settled against my ribs. Mom is a wreck. Vanessa continued her words, spilling out in a frantic rush. She has not slept in 2 days. We do not care about the money anymore. We do not care about the contract or the syndicate. We just want to heal. We just want our family back together before it is too late. Please, Haley, just sign the restructure amendment so we can drop the injunction and focus on keeping Dad alive. He wants you there. He keeps asking if you will invite us to the closing celebration so we can finally celebrate as a family. I closed my eyes. The anger that had fueled me for 8 years flickered, wavering under the sudden influx of familiar guilt. Richard was a flawed, manipulative man, but he was still my father. The thought of him dying in a sterile hospital room while we fought over corporate equity felt grotesque. The emotional red herring worked perfectly. It bypassed my logical defenses and struck directly at the lingering vulnerability of a daughter who had already buried a husband. "I will call you back," I whispered. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the counter. I walked out to the paddocks. Clementine grazed quietly near the fence line, her dark coat gleaming in the morning sun. I rested my arms on the wooden rail, watching her move. For an hour, I seriously debated surrendering. I considered calling Elena and instructing her to draft the 50% transfer. It would end the Whisper campaign, satisfy the syndicate, and potentially save my father's life. I could buy peace. I could purchase the family reunion Vanessa was selling. But the phantom memory of a dark porch light clicking off kept nagging at the edges of my conscience. People who view you as a bad investment rarely experience sudden moral epiphanies. I pulled out my phone and dialed Elena. "Look into Tampa General Hospital," I instructed. "Verify Richard's admission records from yesterday afternoon." There was a brief pause on the line. "Are you reconsidering the settlement, Haley?" "Just verify the medical emergency," I replied. "I need absolute confirmation before I sign away $50 million. Elena did not ask further questions. She possessed a formidable network of private investigators and forensic specialists accustomed to verifying sensitive corporate claims. She promised an update by the end of the business day. I spent the afternoon working in the training facility, trying to distract myself from the looming decision. At 4 o'clock, Elena's number appeared on my screen. I answered immediately. "Your father is not in a cardiac unit," Elena stated. Her tone was sharp, devoid of any sympathetic softening. "He was never admitted to Tampa General. He did not collapse in the foyer." I leaned against the stable wall, feeling the cold reality wash away the manufactured guilt. "Where was he yesterday, Elena?" "He was sitting in a conference room located in the downtown financial district," Elena explained. "My investigator tracked his movements. Richard spent 4 hours meeting with a prominent team of bankruptcy attorneys. The revelation struck like a physical blow. A heart condition was a fabricated narrative designed to manipulate my empathy. The actual emergency was entirely financial." Elena continued outlining the forensic data her team had uncovered. To fund Sylvia's initial proxy attack 7 years ago, and to sustain their lavish lifestyle through Vanessa's repeated business failures, Brenda and Richard required massive liquid capital. They secretly leveraged their pristine Tampa waterfront estate, securing multiple high-interest loans against the property value. They bet everything on the eventual payout from my horse venture. But the market shifted, Elena said. Interest rates climbed. Vanessa's boutique finally collapsed, leaving substantial commercial debt. The lenders holding the mortgages on your parents' estate initiated a margin call. Richard and Brenda are entirely over-leveraged. If they do not secure that $50 million payout from the syndicate within the next 30 days, the banks will seize their home and liquidate their remaining assets. They are fighting for their financial survival. The fabricated heart attack was a desperate tactical maneuver. They needed me to surrender quickly because their own ticking clock was expiring. I walked out of the stables and stared up at the clear blue Florida sky. The lingering guilt vanished, replaced by absolute clarity. They had weaponized my capacity for compassion. "Is there a legal mechanism to break the proxy injunction?" I asked. "I need a poison pill, Elena." I spent the last 6 hours reviewing every single page of the original Wellington contract, Elena replied. "I found a structural flaw. It is a subtle breach of faith clause buried in the indemnification section. The clause mandates that the investor must operate in good faith without any concealed conflicts of interest that could materially damage the primary shareholder. by hiding their familial connection and acting as a secret proxy to manipulate a distressed asset. Sylvia and your parents committed a material breach of fiduciary duty. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked. It means the contract is fraudulent, Elena stated, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. We can file an emergency counter-injunction. A judge will immediately void Sylvia's 20% minority stake. The shares revert entirely back to you. The veto power dissolves, and the syndicate deal proceeds with a clean title. I processed the legal strategy. If we voided the shares, Brenda and Richard would receive zero compensation. The margin call would trigger, and they would lose the waterfront estate. The poetic justice was perfectly symmetrical. File the counter-injunction immediately, I instructed, but do not notify Sylvia or my parents. Request that the judge seal the ruling until the end of the week. Elena hesitated. Why keep it a secret, Haley? If we serve them with a void notice today, the harassment stops instantly. Because serving a legal notice in a quiet office lacks the necessary impact, I replied. They spent the last week running a public smear campaign to destroy my reputation. They tried to manipulate me using a fake terminal illness. They want to be seen. They want a stage. I am going to give them one. I let them believe they had me cornered. I let them believe their veto was ironclad and that I was currently drafting the $50 million surrender document. I just needed them to show their faces at the upcoming closing celebration to spring the trap. The physical transformation of the Ocala farm mirrored the internal shift within my own mind. 48 hours before the scheduled closing celebration, the property hummed with precise, orchestrated activity. Event coordinators directed a team of workers erecting vast white canvas canopies across the manicured front lawns. Delivery trucks backed into the service entrances, unloading crates of crystal glassware and polished silver catering equipment. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and eager anticipation. I stood on the wraparound wooden porch holding a ceramic mug of dark coffee. The sealed court order rested safely inside Elena's downtown vault. The legal guillotine was primed and ready to drop. I watched the workers hoist the main tent poles, feeling a profound sense of untroubled calm. The chaotic anxiety that had defined my 20s was entirely gone. I was no longer a grieving widow trying to calculate diaper costs on a linoleum floor. I was the architect of my own domain. A flash of sunlight reflecting off polished chrome caught my attention. A sleek silver Mercedes turned onto the long asphalt driveway. The vehicle bypassed the designated event parking area and drove directly toward the main farmhouse, ignoring the orange traffic cones. The car stopped abruptly near the porch stairs, sending a scattering of loose gravel into the pristine garden beds. The driver's side door opened. Brenda stepped out into the humid Florida morning. If my father was truly languishing in a cardiac intensive care unit, fighting for his life, my mother certainly did not dress the part of a terrified spouse. She wore a pristine emerald silk blouse tucked into tailored white trousers. A pair of oversized designer sunglasses shielded her eyes. She carried a structured leather handbag that cost more than my first truck. She moved with urgent, rigid purpose, striding toward the porch steps. I did not walk down to meet her. I remained standing on the elevated wooden deck, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Do you have the amendment printed?" she asked. Her voice lacked any trace of the maternal warmth she had weaponized in Wellington. She skipped the polite greetings entirely. The mask was off. I rested my mug on the porch railing. "How is Richard doing?" I asked, keeping my tone flat and conversational. "Vanessa told me his arterial blockages were severe." Brenda waved her manicured hand, brushing the question away as if swatting a nuisance insect. "He is resting comfortably at home. The doctors stabilized him. We do not have time to discuss his medical chart, Haley. The syndicate deadline is approaching." "Sylvia forwarded the revised 50% equity transfer to your lawyer 3 days ago. I expect you to sign it this morning." She stood at the bottom of the stairs staring up at me. The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. She was attempting to extort $50 million while standing on the very property she had tried to steal 7 years prior. I looked closely at her face, studying the rigid set of her jaw and the tight, pinched lines around her mouth. Beneath the arrogant posture and the expensive silk, I saw the unmistakable frantic energy of a cornered animal. The looming bank margin call was breathing down her neck. Her pristine waterfront estate was slipping through her fingers. She needed my signature to survive. "I am not signing the amendment," I told her. The words were soft, but they carried the finality of a closing vault door. Brenda gripped the handle of her leather purse until her knuckles turned pale. "You are being irrational," she snapped. "We secured the original funding that saved this miserable dirt patch. Sylvia was our proxy. We assumed the early financial risk, and we deserve equal compensation for the resulting valuation. If you refuse to sign the transfer, we will maintain the shareholder injunction indefinitely. You will lose the entire syndicate deal." "The injunction is a matter for the corporate attorneys," I replied. "It does not require my signature today." Brenda took one step up the wooden stairs. Her pristine composure began to fracture, revealing the venomous core beneath. "Do not play business games with me, Haley. You think you hold the high ground because you bred a few decent horses. You are still that same terrified girl who showed up on my doorstep with nothing. If you do not authorize the equity transfer right now, Richard and I will attend your little celebration on Saturday. We will stand in front of the syndicate executives, the industry press, and your wealthy buyers. We will loudly contest the ownership structure. We will drag this family dispute into the public spotlight and turn your prestigious corporate buyout into a humiliating high society scandal." She delivered the threat with practiced precision. Brenda assumed I still feared public embarrassment. She relied on the old family dynamic, betting that the ingrained dread of social humiliation would force my compliance. She expected me to shrink back, to apologize, to negotiate a desperate truce, just to maintain a flawless public image. I looked at her emerald blouse. I remembered the dark green silk she wore the night she locked the deadbolt and turned off the porch light. The visual symmetry was perfect. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice to defend my ownership or scream about her fabricated medical emergencies. I relied on the emotional detachment that had become my strongest armor. I let a heavy, stretching silence fall between us. I watched her breathe, waiting for her to realize that her threats were striking a concrete wall. "You should wear your good silk blouse on Saturday," I said smoothly. My voice was eerily calm, devoid of any defensive posture. Brenda blinked. The unexpected response derailed her momentum. She frowned, trying to decipher the hidden meaning behind my invitation. She interpreted my serene compliance as a form of foolish, naive bravado. She thought I was simply bluffing, hoping to call her bluff in return. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," she warned, her tone dripping with condescension. "We will see you on Saturday. Do not expect any mercy when the cameras start flashing." The screen door behind me creaked open on its hinges. Rosa stepped out onto the porch. She did not say a word to the woman standing on the stairs. She carried a folded piece of fabric in her hands. The morning air carried a slight, unseasonable chill. Rosa stepped behind me and gently draped the faded yellow knitted blanket over my shoulders. She smoothed the worn yarn against my collar, patting my back with a quiet, steady reassurance. Brenda watched the interaction with undisguised revulsion. Her eyes darted from the cheap frayed blanket to Rosa's simple cotton dress. She scoffed a sharp, derisive sound of pure, elite disgust. She could not comprehend how I could value this rustic, unpolished existence over the glamorous, high society life she offered. She turned around her heel, striking the gravel driveway. She climbed back into the driver's seat of her luxury vehicle, slamming the heavy door shut. The silver engine roared to life. I stood on the porch with the yellow blanket wrapped around my shoulders, feeling the residual warmth of Rosa's touch. I watched the Mercedes accelerate down the asphalt lane, kicking up a trailing cloud of white dust. Brenda drove away, confident she held the upper hand. She believed her aggressive intimidation tactics had secured her inevitable victory. She thought she was driving back to a pristine waterfront mansion. She did not know the bank already owned the driveway. Saturday arrived, bringing a flawless Florida morning. The sky hung clear and vibrant, a brilliant canopy of unbroken blue stretched tight over the Ocala landscape. The physical transformation of the farm was complete. Massive white canvas tents dotted the manicured green lawns, creating shaded pavilions for the 300 invited guests. Waitstaff moved efficiently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A low wooden stage sat positioned at the edge of the primary jumping arena, facing rows of white padded chairs. This was not merely a corporate closing party, it was a victory lap. The guest list reflected the true foundation of the empire, the dedicated farmhands who had hauled heavy feed sacks through the brutal summer heat stood near the catered buffet, wearing clean-pressed shirts. The independent software developers who had coded our proprietary genetics algorithm mingled with wealthy independent breeders. The lead executive from the global syndicate stood near the front row, adjusting his tailored suit, projecting the quiet confidence of a man about to acquire a crown jewel asset. Hector and Rosa occupied the two center seats in the very first row. Rosa wore a simple dark blue dress, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Hector sat beside her, wearing a rigid dark suit he clearly found uncomfortable, pulling occasionally at his collar. Leo and Maya ran across the grass near the stage, their laughter cutting through the ambient hum of polite adult conversation. I stood near the edge of the main tent speaking quietly with Elena. My lawyer wore a sharp charcoal pantsuit holding a slim leather briefcase against her side. We reviewed the final sequence of the impending presentation. The atmosphere felt light, buoyant, fueled by the collective energy of shared success. Then the energy shifted. The heavy iron entry gates located at the end of the long asphalt driveway swung wide open. I felt the change before I saw it. A subtle ripple of tense silence spread through the perimeter of the crowd. The quiet, localized hush moved inward like a slow, rolling wave, indicating the arrival of a disruptive foreign element. I turned my head. Brenda, Richard, and Vanessa walked confidently through the open gates. They moved with an aggressive, coordinated synchronization. They were not invited. Their names did not appear on any guest registry or security clearance list. Yet they marched onto the private grounds, projecting an overwhelming aura of supreme entitlement. The visual contrast was jarring. While the actual architects of the Martinez brand wore comfortable, functional attire, my biological family arrived dressed for a high-fashion editorial spread. Brenda wore the exact emerald silk blouse she had worn during her driveway ambush, paired with a sweeping white skirt. Richard sported a double-breasted linen suit that looked freshly pressed. Vanessa flanked them, wearing a designer cocktail dress and oversized sunglasses. They did not slip quietly into the back rows. They immediately began working the perimeter of the crowd. The dramatic irony was staggering. I stood next to Elena holding the sealed court order that guaranteed their absolute financial ruin. The syndicate executives nearby were already briefed on the dissolved injunction. The core members of my team understood the brutal legal reality. Yet my parents operated under the delusional assumption that their secret proxy veto remained ironclad. They believed they were mere hours away from receiving a $50 million wire transfer. I watched the bizarre performance unfold. Brenda flagged down a regional equestrian journalist, gesturing expansively toward the pristine training compound. I could not hear her exact words, but her body language screamed maternal pride. She placed her manicured hand over her heart, pointing toward me and then toward the sprawling estate, loudly claiming public credit for my resilience. Richard shook hands with the bewildered software developers, projecting the false humility of a successful patriarch watching his legacy flourish. Vanessa posed for a photographer near the catering tent, ensuring her designer dress caught the best lighting. They were constructing their final, hollow narrative. They wanted the cameras to capture their supportive presence right before they publicly demanded their 50% equity share. They were laying the visual groundwork for their impending extortion. Elena stepped closer to my side, her eyes narrowed tracking Richard as he navigated through the rows of white chairs. They bypassed the checkpoint, Elena murmured, her voice tight with professional irritation. Should I signal the private security detail? We can have them quietly escorted off the property before the formal presentation begins. It would prevent any public scene. I watched Brenda physically shoulder past a group of local breeders to secure a better vantage point near the center aisle. She wanted to be close to the stage. She wanted a front row seat for her anticipated triumph. I shook my head, keeping my gaze locked on the emerald silk blouse. "No," I whispered. "Do not intercept them." Elena frowned, gripping her leather briefcase. "Haley, they intend to hijack the microphone. They are preparing to launch a hostile verbal dispute the moment you announce the sale. If Brenda starts screaming about proxy shares and stolen equity, it will severely damage the optics of the transition." "Optics only matter when the underlying structure is fragile," I replied, my tone perfectly serene. "Our structure is concrete. Let them get to the front. Let them get as close to the camera lenses as possible." I understood the psychology driving their aggressive public intrusion. My family thrived on the threat of public humiliation. They believed the mere possibility of a chaotic, loud confrontation would force me into immediate compliance. They expected me to panic to usher them into a private back room and hastily sign the $50 million amendment just to preserve the flawless surface of the celebration. They did not understand that I was no longer playing defense. I was not trying to protect a fragile surface. I was preparing to detonate the foundation. Brenda, Richard, and Vanessa reached the front of the seating area. They completely ignored Hector and Rosa, bypassing the true matriarch and patriarch of the farm without offering a single nod of acknowledgement. They commandeered 3 empty chairs positioned directly across the center aisle from my in-laws. Brenda sat down, crossing her legs with sharp, elegant precision. She looked up at the wooden stage, her eyes gleaming with dark, arrogant victory. The ambient noise of the crowd began to settle. The scheduled start time approached. The syndicate executives took their designated seats, holding their thick contractual folders. The journalists readied their notepads. A profound, expectant hush fell over the 300 guests. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the clean Florida air fill my lungs. The fear that had once ruled my life, the paralyzing dread of my mother's disapproval, the desperate craving for my father's validation, it was all gone, replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of the truth. I reached out and Elena handed me the slate gray leather folio. It contained the final syndication documents. Tucked safely behind those heavy corporate pages rested the printed email from 8 years ago and the sealed judicial order dissolving their proxy shares. I gripped the smooth leather. I turned away from the edge of the tent and walked slowly up the 2 wooden steps onto the low stage. I approached the microphone standing in the exact center of the platform. 300 faces looked up at me. In the front row, Brenda offered a tight, triumphant smile, ready to collect her ransom. I adjusted the microphone stand, feeling the cool metal under my fingers. It was time to balance the ledger. I stood before the microphone. The midday sun beat down on the vast white canvas canopy above me, casting a diffused, glowing light across the faces of 300 guests. I did not tap the metal grill to command their attention. I did not ask the crowd to quiet down. I simply lowered my voice. When you speak softly in a large open space, people must stop moving in order to hear you. The strategy worked instantly. The faint clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased. The catering staff paused mid-stride, holding their silver trays perfectly still. The ambient hum of high society conversation evaporated, leaving a thick, expectant silence hanging over the manicured lawn. I looked directly at the front row. Brenda sat with her legs crossed, maintaining her practiced, radiant smile for the benefit of the nearby equestrian journalists. Richard adjusted the lapels of his crisp linen suit, projecting the aura of a proud patriarch. Vanessa held her phone up, ready to record the moment of their supposed financial triumph. 8 years ago, I began my voice, carrying through the amplification system with quiet, ringing clarity. My life ended on a Tuesday. I kept my tone clinical, stripping away any melodramatic inflection. I delivered the harsh facts like a forensic report. I told the silent crowd about the rusted grading tractor flipping on a wet incline. I stated my age at the time, 26 years old. I mentioned the 2 infants sleeping in the back of a battered truck. Then I stated the exact numerical value of my net worth that evening, $14 and some loose change. A physical ripple of profound discomfort passed through the audience. Wealthy equestrian investors, corporate executives, and elite breeders are generally insulated from the raw, ugly mechanics of sudden poverty. Hearing the stark, unforgiving numbers laid out under the bright Florida sun disrupted the festive, luxurious atmosphere of the event. In the front row, Brenda shifted her weight in her padded white chair. Her radiant smile grew strained, becoming brittle around the edges. This was not the glamorous origin story she had pitched to the regional reporters during the cocktail hour. She wanted a public narrative centered on fierce determination and unwavering family support. She did not want the high society crowd envisioning her daughter destitute, desperate, and abandoned. I told the audience about driving to a pristine waterfront home, seeking a temporary guest room. I described a heavy mahogany door shutting and a deadbolt sliding into place. I mentioned a porch light clicking off, leaving a young widow standing in the dark. I did not name names. I did not point my finger at the emerald silk blouse sitting 10 feet away from the podium. I did not have to. The sharp, pointed omission carried its own devastating gravity. The journalists lowered their cameras, listening intently. Brenda dropped her hands into her lap, her knuckles turning pale against her designer leather purse. Then I shifted my gaze across the center aisle. I looked at Hector and Rosa Martinez. I drove away from that dark porch and pulled into a neon-lit gas station, I told the crowd. I was terrified. I was drowning, but a battered dual-cab pickup truck arrived. The people inside that truck did not ask me for a strategic business plan. They did not calculate my potential market value or view my children as a financial burden. A woman wrapped my son and daughter in a faded yellow knitted blanket. A man drove us to his foreclosed farm and gave us a solid roof. I paused, letting the heavy weight of those actions settle over the audience. I felt the presence of Julian in that moment. Building this equine empire was never solely about corporate revenge. It was about honoring the unseen leverage, the quiet strength of the people who held the line when the world collapsed. We are often told that family is a biological default, I continued, my voice steady and unwavering, but biology is just a random genetic lottery. True family is an active daily choice. True family sets an extra plate at a scarred wooden kitchen table when they barely have enough food for themselves. True family does not measure affection through a hidden ledger. They do not ask for a return on investment. I glanced toward the corporate seating section. The lead executive from the global syndicate sat leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He gave a slow, respectful nod. Men who navigate billion-dollar acquisitions recognize genuine loyalty when they see it. They understand the rare intrinsic value of an unshakable moral foundation. They respect leaders who know exactly who built their walls. On the other side of the aisle, the fabricated facade was actively crumbling. Vanessa uncrossed her legs, leaning over to whisper frantically into Richard's ear. She shot a panicked, wide-eyed look toward the media cameras, realizing the public narrative was slipping rapidly out of their control. Richard wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, checking his watch with jerky, nervous movements. The orchestrated image of the united, loving family dissolved under the harsh, unfiltered light of undeniable facts. Yet they remained in their seats. They were waiting for the inevitable pivot. They tolerated the uncomfortable backstory because they believed the monumental payout was imminent. They assumed this speech was the required theatrical prelude to the corporate buyout announcement. They waited for me to yield to the $50 million ransom demand. Today we stand on the threshold of a historical transition, I said, shifting the focus to the impending syndicate acquisition. Our proprietary genetic software and the Martinez bloodline have attracted unprecedented global attention. A transaction of this magnitude alters the landscape of an entire industry. It generates staggering wealth, and extreme wealth acts like a blinding beacon. It summons predators. It attracts people who believe they are entitled to the harvest, despite never planting a single seed. The silence under the canvas tent grew razor sharp. Elena stood near the edge of the stage, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the crowd with hawk-like precision. I picked up the slate-gray leather folio from the podium. I held it up for the entire crowd to see. The smooth material caught the sunlight. Before any final signature is placed on the syndication contract, before any corporate funds change hands, the foundation of this empire must be secured, I stated. Emotions are fickle. Public narratives can be manipulated and distorted. But true, enduring power is not rooted in sentiment or high society gossip. True power is rooted in irreversible property law. I lifted a stack of heavy watermark documents from the folder. The embossed county clerk stamps flashed in the light. I've spent the last 3 weeks working closely with my legal counsel to ensure that the people who actually built this farm will never be vulnerable to external extortion, I told the audience. We executed a series of rigorous, irrevocable trusts and deed transfers. The underlying assets have already been distributed. The audience held its collective breath. In the front row, Vanessa stopped whispering. Richard sat frozen, staring at the documents. Brenda sat up perfectly straight, her eyes locked onto the gray folder in my hands. The ransom she demanded was 50%. She thought the crisp papers I held were the restructured equity amendments granting her hidden proxy holding company half of the impending fortune. She believed her aggressive driveway ambush had succeeded. I unfastened the silver metallic clasp of the folio. The sound echoed softly through the microphone. My mother leaned forward, waiting for her name to be called. She was about to get exactly what she asked for 8 years ago. I reached into the slate-gray folio and extracted the first stack of heavy, watermarked paper. The pages felt thick between my fingers, holding the gravity of a profound structural shift. I looked out over the sea of expectant faces gathered under the white canvas canopy. My gaze bypassed the wealthy investors seated in the front rows and searched the perimeter. I found the faces of the farmhands, the groomers, the veterinary assistants, the people who understood the grueling, unforgiving reality of rural labor. I established the Julian Martinez Foundation, I announced, my voice carrying a quiet, resonant strength through the speakers. It is a fully capitalized charitable endowment funded in perpetuity by the initial proceeds of this syndication deal. It exists for one specific purpose: to provide immediate, unconditional financial intervention for widowed mothers operating in the agricultural sector. A heavy, respectful silence blanketed the crowd. I let the words settle, outlining the precise function of the new institution. When tragedy strikes a working farm, the financial devastation is usually instantaneous, I explained, keeping my tone level and factual. Lenders do not pause to offer sympathy. Banks do not halt their collection cycles to accommodate grief. The foundation ensures that no young woman in this industry will ever have to choose between feeding her children and paying a commercial mortgage. No widow will ever have to drive through the night to beg for a guest room on a dark porch. They will never be turned away. They will have a fortress. A sudden, warm wave of applause rolled through the tent, starting from the back rows and sweeping forward. The journalists scribbled rapidly on their notepads, recognizing the compelling human interest angle embedded within the corporate buyout. I glanced toward my biological family. Vanessa sat rigid, her jaw tightening. She leaned back in her padded white chair, crossing her arms tight against her chest. Every dollar funneled into a charitable endowment represented a dollar she could not use to salvage her sinking downtown retail boutique. I allowed the applause to taper off into a respectful hush. I reached back into the leather folio and withdrew a second set of thick legal binders. The embossed county seals gleamed, catching the ambient sunlight. I stepped away from the podium and walked to the edge of the low wooden stage, looking directly down the center aisle. "Hector Rosa," I said, projecting my voice without the aid of the microphone. "Please stand up." Hector looked hesitant. His calloused hands gripped the knees of his dark suit trousers. Rosa touched his arm, offering a quiet reassurance, and they rose together. They looked out of place among the high society elites standing shoulder to shoulder in their simple, modest clothing. They were the truest royalty in the room. I leaned down and handed the thick, heavy binders directly to Hector. The weight of the paper seemed to surprise him. He looked down at the crisp cover page, his eyes scanning the dense legal typography. "That is the recorded deed to the original 60 acres and the expanded Olympic training compound," I told them. "The property is signed over to you free and clear. It cannot be taxed away or foreclosed upon. It belongs to the Martinez family forever. Attached to that deed is an 8-figure irrevocable retirement trust. The capital is locked, restricted, and fully funded." Rosa lifted her hand, covering her mouth. Her eyes filled with unshed tears welling up and spilling over her cheeks. Hector stared at the legal documents, his broad shoulders trembling slightly under the fabric of his suit jacket. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest the overwhelming generosity, but the words caught in his throat. "Because you set a plate for me when I had nothing," I said, ensuring my voice carried across the silent, manicured lawn. "You will never have to ask for anything again." The reaction was instantaneous and electric. The lead executive from the global syndicate stood up first, initiating the movement. The wealthy breeders, the software developers, the local farmhands followed his lead. 300 guests rose to their feet in unison. The standing ovation cascaded across the white tents. The applause roared deafening and pure, washing over the modest couple from Ocala, who had simply chosen quiet kindness over calculated extortion. In the front row, 3 people remained seated. Brenda, Richard, and Vanessa did not stand. They sat anchored to their padded white chairs, isolated islands of bitter resentment amidst a sea of joyous celebration. They watched their anticipated fortune evaporate into thin air, being handed away to charity and to the very people they viewed as uneducated rural laborers. Their proxy trap was disintegrating before their eyes. The applause sustained for several long minutes before slowly receding as the guests returned to their seats. The lingering joy in the air felt palpable, a bright, buzzing energy that filled the space. Then the breaking point arrived. Brenda could no longer maintain the pristine high society facade. The polite, polished mask cracked, shattering into jagged, resentful pieces. The looming margin call, the impending loss of her waterfront estate, the utter humiliation of being bypassed drove her over the edge. She pushed herself out of her chair. The sudden aggressive movement caused her seat to scrape harshly against the pavement. Her emerald silk blouse wrinkled as she marched forward, closing the short distance between the front row and the edge of the wooden stage. She ignored the media cameras. She ignored the elite equestrian investors she had spent the entire morning trying to impress. "You cannot do this!" she screamed. Her voice tore through the lingering quiet, shrill and frantic. The crowd froze. The journalists turned their camera lenses toward the elegant woman standing at the base of the platform. Her face flushed a dark mottled red. "You do not have the authority to give this property away," Brenda shouted, pointing a trembling manicured finger at the binders resting in Hector's hands. "We own 20% of this operation. We hold the proxy shares. We secured the early funding. You cannot finalize this corporate buyout without our signature. We have a veto clause and we demand our equity." A collective gasp swept through the tent. Brenda had just publicly confessed her hidden corporate espionage. In her blind panic to secure the ransom, she openly admitted to utilizing a secret proxy investor to exploit her own widowed daughter. The elite breeders and syndicate executives murmured, exchanging shocked, disgusted glances. The dramatic irony had reached its peak. The predator had just unmasked herself in front of the entire industry. Richard stood up, reaching out to grab her arm, trying to pull her back from the precipice of public ruin. Brenda yanked her arm away, refusing to retreat. "I want our $50 million, Brenda demanded, staring up at me with furious, desperate eyes. "We built this opportunity for you. You are not cutting us out. You cannot do this without us." The entire venue went dead quiet. 300 pairs of eyes shifted from the screaming woman in the emerald blouse back to me standing behind the microphone. They waited to see how the young widow, the corporate architect, would handle a hostile public extortion attempt. I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me. The suffocating weight I had carried for 8 years lifted off my shoulders. The heavy, invisible burden of seeking her approval, the lingering dread of her rejection, vanished into the clear Florida sky. I felt lighter than air. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic pitch. I just looked at the microphone and said, "You do not own anything, Brenda, and Elena is happy to explain why." Elena moved with the calculated grace of a seasoned litigator. She stepped up to the microphone, replacing me at the center of the wooden platform. She did not raise her voice to command the space. Her sheer authority anchored the attention of every person gathered under the white canvas canopy. She opened her slim leather briefcase and produced a single sheet of judicial stationery bearing the heavy embossed seal of the local circuit court. 2 days ago, Elena began addressing the silent crowd, but keeping her dark eyes fixed entirely on the woman in the emerald silk blouse. An emergency hearing convened in the downtown financial district. We presented irrefutable forensic accounting evidence detailing a coordinated campaign of severe corporate fraud and concealed conflicts of interest. Elena outlined the legal architecture of the proxy trap with surgical precision. She explained how the original Wellington investor operated as a silent front for a hostile familial acquisition. She cited the specific breach of faith clauses embedded within the 7-year-old contract. The corporate executives seated in the front rows nodded in quiet recognition. They understood the lethal nature of a compromised fiduciary duty. They respected the airtight defense strategy playing out before them. Because the investor deliberately concealed her relationship with the Martinez family, Elena stated, her tone dropping like a heavy iron vault door. The presiding judge issued an immediate summary ruling. The 20% minority equity stake was legally nullified 48 hours ago. The shares reverted entirely back to the primary founder. The shareholder veto power is legally dead. You possess zero equity in this enterprise. The words hung over the manicured lawn. Zero equity. The entire extortion plot dissolved into fine dust, drifting away on the Florida breeze. Brenda stared up at the stage. The arrogant flush drained rapidly from her face, leaving behind a stark, pale mask of sheer terror. She looked back over her shoulder at Richard. He stood, frozen, his crisp linen suit suddenly appearing far too large for his shrinking posture. A heavy bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He understood the mechanical ruthlessness of corporate law. Vanessa gripped the back of her white padded chair, her designer sunglasses slipping down her nose. She realized in real time that her failing boutique would never receive a financial rescue. But profound narcissism rarely surrenders quietly. Brenda refused to accept the structural collapse of her scheme. She gripped the edge of the wooden platform, her knuckles turning stark white against the dark painted wood. "That is a lie!" Brenda shrieked. Her voice cracked, losing all its refined high society polish. The facade of the elegant, supportive mother vanished, exposing the desperate panic beneath.
"We sacrificed everything for this investment. We leveraged our entire lives to secure that initial funding. We put our own home on the line to buy that Wellington contract. You are stealing from us. You owe us that money."
She had just exposed her final critical vulnerability. In her frantic, unthinking rage, she confessed the desperate gamble Richard had orchestrated. She admitted they had mortgaged their pristine Tampa waterfront estate to play a high-stakes game of corporate espionage against their own daughter. I stepped around Elena and walked to the very edge of the low stage. I looked down at the woman who had locked me out in the cold. I held the slate-gray leather folio in my right hand. This was the same folder my parents assumed contained their lucrative buyout amendment. It was the same folder they thought would secure their lavish retirement and clear their hidden debts. I crouched down slightly, bringing myself closer to her eye level. I extended my arm and handed the smooth leather portfolio directly to Brenda. She snatched it from my grip. Her hands trembled visibly as she unfastened the silver metallic clasp. She ripped the cover open, expecting to find a complex legal settlement or a negotiated payout check. She desperately wanted a compromise. She prayed for a fraction of the fortune. She found 2 pieces of paper. The first document was not a corporate contract. It was a printed email thread. The ink was slightly faded from sitting in a locked desk drawer for 8 years, but the harsh black text remained entirely legible. Brenda stared at the page. Her eyes darted across the lines, tracking her own cruel words. She read the sentence where she explicitly called me a bad investment. She saw Richard agreeing to keep the door cracked only if my equine venture turned a profit. The undeniable physical proof of their transactional love stared back at her, exposed under the bright midday sun. Brenda let out a small, choked gasp. She tried to shove the email away, but her trembling fingers caught the second document stapled directly beneath it. It was a heavy cardstock notice bearing the official seal of a major commercial banking institution. "You gambled your entire estate on a fraudulent proxy contract," I told her. My voice remained perfectly calm, carrying the serene weight of deep closure. "When the judge voided your hidden shares 48 hours ago, your collateral evaporated. The lenders holding the mortgages on your Tampa property received automatic notification of the judicial ruling. Richard let out a hollow, ragged groaning sound. He understood the swift, unforgiving mechanics of commercial banking. He knew what that cardstock document represented before I even spoke the words aloud. The margin call triggered yesterday morning. I continued outlining the final consequence of their unyielding greed. Your outstanding loans defaulted. There is no payout coming to save you. The bank is currently seizing your waterfront home. You have nothing left. The poetic justice struck with devastating symmetry. They had tried to acquire my foreclosed dirt farm by exploiting my grief. They had planned to profit from my vulnerability. Now, my calculated success had directly triggered the foreclosure of their pristine luxury estate. They were bankrupt. They were socially ruined in front of the very high society elite they worshipped. They were about to become exactly what they despised. Brenda looked down at the banking notice. The reality of her total destruction washed over her. Her face froze, contorting into a mask of paralyzed horror. Her knees buckled slightly, and she swayed against the wooden stage for physical support. She looked up at me, her eyes begging for a mercy she had never once extended to anyone else. She wanted the daughter who used to crave her approval. I stood up tall, feeling the warm Florida breeze brush past my face. You told me you could not be my safety net, I said, delivering the final irrevocable truth, so I built my own, and you are not allowed inside. I gave a subtle nod toward the perimeter of the tent. The lead executive from the global syndicate had already signaled his private security detail. 4 men wearing dark-tailored suits and earpieces stepped out from the shadows of the catering pavilion. They moved with swift, professional efficiency. They flanked Brenda Richard and Vanessa, forming an impenetrable physical barrier around the sputtering, ruined family. Brenda tried to shout my name one last time, but a security officer gently gripped her elbow, guiding her firmly toward the exit. Richard followed, with his head bowed, staring at the crushed gravel beneath his expensive leather shoes. Vanessa walked behind them, weeping silently into her hands. I watched them walk out the iron gates with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And then I turned around and went back to my party. The week following the celebration felt like exhaling a breath I had held trapped in my lungs for 8 long years. The syndication deal closed flawlessly on a Tuesday morning. I sat in Elena's pristine, glass-walled office and signed the final transfer documents. I watched the digital confirmation screen route the monumental funds directly into the irrevocable trusts. There were no hidden clauses remaining to ambush me. There were no proxy shareholders lurking in the shadows, waiting to steal my labor. The equine empire I built from the dirt up transitioned seamlessly into a corporate entity, leaving me standing on the other side with profound, untouchable freedom. Of course, the noise from Tampa did not cease immediately. Toxic entitlement rarely surrenders without a final, desperate, chaotic tantrum. Over the next month, my phone captured a sporadic stream of frantic, hostile voicemails. Vanessa led the futile charge. She left rambling audio messages, threatening me with nebulous lawsuits, claiming she would find a rogue appellate judge to overturn the summary ruling. She promised to drag my name through civil litigation until I surrendered her demanded share. She blamed me for the final collapse of her downtown boutique, claiming my selfishness ruined her entrepreneurial dreams. I listened to her hollow threats while standing in my sunlit kitchen, pouring a cup of morning coffee. I did not feel a single spike of adrenaline. I did not feel the familiar urge to defend myself. Elena had constructed a legal fortress so dense and structurally perfect that no desperate Tampa attorney would even agree to review their case. The judicial order voiding the proxy shares was permanent. My parents had committed documented corporate fraud and breached their fiduciary duties. They possessed zero legal standing. I pressed the delete button halfway through Vanessa's 4th voicemail, erasing her frantic voice from my life with a simple, satisfying keystroke. I never heard from her again. The high society circles of Florida operate on a ruthless currency of perception and prestige. The media coverage surrounding the syndication buyout heavily featured the dramatic scene that unfolded under the white canvas canopy in Ocala. Equestrian journalists possess long memories and sharp pens. They published detailed accounts of the proxy trap, exposing the calculated betrayal my parents had orchestrated. The articles laid out the forensic paper trail proving that Richard and Brenda had attempted to extort their widowed daughter while hiding behind a Wellington shell company. The social backlash in Tampa struck swift and unforgiving. The wealthy elite circles that my mother worshipped despise public scandal, especially when it involves documented financial ruin. My parents found themselves instantly exiled from the very world they considered their birthright. The premier golf club Richard boasted about on Christmas morning quietly revoked his membership, citing a violation of their conduct clauses. The charity gala boards Brenda used to chair stopped returning her calls entirely. They became social pariahs, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The banking institutions proved even less forgiving than their socialite friends. The margin call triggered a rapid, relentless foreclosure process. The lenders seized the pristine waterfront estate, auctioning off the imported palms, the crushed shell driveway, and the heavy mahogany door that had once been shut in my face. Stripped of their assets and drowning in commercial debt, my parents were forced to relocate quickly. According to a brief legal update from Elena, they downsized into a cramped two-bedroom rented apartment situated above a noisy intersection. They ended up in the exact precarious, vulnerable living situation they had so coldly condemned me to endure. The cycle of poetic justice closed in a perfect, flawless circle. I did not revel in their downfall. I did not drive down to Tampa to gloat. I simply stopped looking in their direction entirely. I had a beautiful new horizon to navigate. I did not purchase a sprawling mansion or a fleet of luxury vehicles. Extreme wealth offers many loud distractions, but I used the capital to buy the quietest existence possible. I retained a modest 20-acre parcel of rolling green pasture located just 3 miles down the road from Hector and Rosa. I built a modern, comfortable farmhouse with wide wraparound porches and large windows that let the morning light flood the hardwood floors. I kept a small private stable out back. I no longer breed horses to satisfy a commercial ledger or meet the frantic demands of international buyers. I kept a few direct descendants of Clementine simply for the profound love of the animal. I spend my early mornings walking the fence line, watching the compact, powerful warm bloods graze in the mist. I watch them load their weight and snap over low practice rails, not to win ribbons, but because it is what they were born to do. I run my hands over their dark coats, feeling the strong, steady rhythm of their breathing. They run free and unburdened, much like the woman watching them from the gate. Hector and Rosa visit the new property almost every afternoon. The 8-figure retirement trust allows them to live without checking price tags or worrying about seasonal crop yields. They travel occasionally, taking quiet trips to the coast, but they always return to Ocala because it is the only soil they truly love. Hector spends his days teaching Leo how to mend leather tack, while Rosa teaches Maya how to bake cinnamon bread in my kitchen, using the exact same recipe that saved me on my first night in their home. My twins are thriving. They are growing up surrounded by wide open spaces and the unshakable certainty that they are deeply, unconditionally valued. Their futures are secured by the irrevocable educational trusts Elena drafted. They will never know the hollow terror of counting loose change on a linoleum floor. They will never have to beg a relative for a safe place to sleep. People often assume that acquiring $100 million fundamentally changes a person's soul. It does not. The money did not alter my core identity or erase the memory of the struggles that forged me. What the capital actually purchased was an invisible, impenetrable shield. It bought me the pure luxury of selective gravity. I get to choose what matters, and I get to choose who occupies the space around my table. The noise of the outside world simply bounces off the walls of the life I built. I spent the first half of my 20s believing I could earn the affection of people who viewed love as a transactional commodity. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I stayed quiet enough, if I achieved enough success, my biological family would eventually see my worth. It took a tragedy and a dark porch to teach me the hardest lesson of adulthood. You cannot scream a toxic family into loving you. You cannot argue them into respecting your boundaries. You cannot present a logical spreadsheet proving your worth and expect a narcissist to suddenly develop genuine empathy. Their ledgers are rigged from the start, and you will always end up owing a debt you never actually incurred. The only way to win a rigged game is to walk away from the table entirely. You stop arguing, you stop pleading for a guest room, you harness that raw, agonizing rejection, and you use it as building material. You put your head down and you quietly outbuild them. You construct a foundation so solid and a fortress so high that their opinions simply no longer matter. They become tiny voices shouting at a concrete wall while you enjoy the warmth inside your own home. That is the story of the Martinez bloodline. It is the story of a foreclosed dirt farm, a compact brown mare, and the legal contract that balanced the scales forever. Silence is a gift you give to people who deserve your peace, but boundaries are the iron gates you build for those who do not. If you have someone in your life keeping score, stop trying to balance the math. Build your own house, lock the door, and let them count outside. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to build your own safety net. Hit subscribe to join our community, and I will see you in the next one. There is a profound difference between raising a child and managing an asset. In a culture that increasingly worships the appearance of success, it is dangerously easy for the lines to blur. We live in a society that often equates a pristine waterfront estate and a designer wardrobe with good parenting. We are conditioned to believe that providing for our children means securing the right zip code and the prestigious private school or the elite country club membership. But looking back at the long, winding road that brought me from a dark Tampa porch to a $100 million equine empire, I have realized that the true currency of American family life is not financial. It is emotional. My biological parents operated under a transactional philosophy. They viewed family as a corporate ledger, where affection was distributed based on anticipated returns. In their minds, my sister Vanessa was a blue-chip stock, worthy of constant investment and public praise, while I, a young widow with 2 infants, was deemed a bad investment. This is the tragic flaw that fractures so many modern families. When parents raise children with a hidden invoice attached to their love, they do not build a family, they build a debtor's prison. Children raised in this environment learn very quickly that their worth is conditional. They are taught to perform, to suppress their authentic selves, and to constantly monitor the shifting moods of their parents, just to maintain a fragile, precarious peace. Contrast this with the worn, scarred wooden table in Ocala. Hector and Rosa Martinez did not have wealth. They were staring down the barrel of a commercial foreclosure, terrified of losing the very roof over their heads. Yet when I arrived at their door with $14 and 2 hungry babies, they did not ask for a business plan. They did not calculate the cost of my presence. Rosa simply wrapped my children in a faded yellow blanket, and Hector set an extra plate. This is the bedrock of genuine family responsibility. True traditional family values are rooted in honesty, fairness, and a profound emotional awareness that recognizes humanity over utility. It is the quiet, unglamorous work of showing up for the people you love, especially when they have virtually nothing to offer you in return. The traditional American family structure was never meant to function like a boardroom. The dinner table is meant to be a sanctuary, a place of equality, where the day's burdens are shared, not leveraged for future favors. Now as I raise Leo and Maya on our quiet 20-acre farm, these lessons form the very core of my parenting. I want my children to grow up understanding the value of hard work, not because it will earn my approval, but because it will build their own unshakable character. I want them to know that while the American dream of building a vast, successful enterprise is a beautiful pursuit, it is entirely hollow if you do not have a safe harbor to anchor your soul. I teach them to be fiercely independent, to understand contracts, and to read the fine print of the world. But I also teach them to keep their hearts open to those who genuinely need a yellow blanket in the dark. Emotional awareness is perhaps the greatest inheritance a parent can leave behind. It is the ability to look at your child and see a distinct human being, not an extension of your own ego. It is the capacity to admit when you are wrong, to apologize without attaching a defensive caveat, and to foster an environment where fairness dictates the rules of the house. When we raise children with this kind of emotional integrity, we equip them to navigate a world that is often harsh and transactional. We give them the internal compass required to distinguish between the people who love them and the people who simply want to use them. Parenting with honesty means having the courage to tell your children the truth about the world, while simultaneously assuring them that your home will always be a place of unfiltered grace. It requires a parent to step back and allow their child to fail, to struggle, and to find their own footing, knowing that the safety net provided is woven from unconditional support, not strings of obligation. If Richard and Brenda had possessed even a fraction of this emotional awareness, they might have recognized that the daughter standing on their porch was not a financial liability, but a human being in the darkest moment of her life. Their failure to see me was not a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of their profound internal poverty. These are the quiet, critical lessons that separate the families who endure from the ones that shatter under pressure. If you have ever had to decipher the difference between transactional affection and true love, or if you are in the process of building your own unshakable boundaries to protect your children, you are not walking this path alone. Join our community and follow the channel Revenge Order. We share the stories of those who learn to outbuild the toxicity in their lives, finding justice not through screaming matches, but through silent, undeniable success. Ultimately, the long-term guidance we provide our children is not written in syndication contracts, trust funds, or corporate buyouts. It is written in the moments when the lights go out and the chips are down. It is found in the memory of who opened the door and who slid the deadbolt shut. I look at my life now, the quiet mornings, watching the horses graze in the mist, the sound of my children laughing in the kitchen, the steady presence of the in-laws who chose to be my true parents. And I realize that the most valuable thing I ever built was not a $100 million empire. It was a boundary. Sometimes late at night I sit on my wraparound porch and look out into the dark Florida pastures. The air is warm, the cicadas are humming, and the world feels perfectly still. I think about the people who spend their entire lives keeping score, meticulously tallying their perceived sacrifices, never realizing that their ledgers have bankrupted their own souls. You can spend your whole life trying to buy your way into a house that never wanted you, or you can pick up a hammer and build your own. And as the porch light casts a soft amber glow across the wooden floorboards, I find myself wondering about the people sitting in that cramped, noisy apartment in Tampa. When the individuals who locked you out finally realize the cold reality of the dark, do they ever learn how to build a fire? Or do they just sit in the shadows, waiting for someone else to turn on the light,